The morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life, I found Margaret Henley standing in my driveway at 6 a.m., holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that could freeze hell over. She had come to serve me papers and emergency injunction to stop my wedding. My wedding. On my own property. "I'm sorry, dear," she said, though we both knew she wasn't sorry at all. "But this little gathering of yours violates 17 different HOA regulations. The ceremony is canceled." I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching 23 years of my life flash before my eyes. 23 years of payments, improvements, and calling this place home. And now this woman who had moved into our peaceful Willow Creek community just 18 months ago, was telling me I couldn't celebrate the most important day of my life on the land I owned. But Margaret had made one critical mistake. She assumed I would just roll over and let her win. She had no idea what she had just awakened. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story isn't really about a wedding at all. It's about power, control, and what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. My name is Sarah, and I've lived at 847 Willow Creek Lane for over 2 decades. When my late husband Tom and I first bought this place, it was just raw land, 5 beautiful acres backing up to Mirror Lake, with nothing but dreams and a massive mortgage. We built our home ourselves, board by board, working weekends and evenings until we had something that felt like paradise. 2 years later, I met David at a grief counseling group. He was gentle, patient, and understood loss in a way that only someone who has walked that path can understand. When he proposed last spring by the lake, with the sunset painting the water gold, I knew Tom would have approved. We decided to have a small ceremony right here on the property, just family and close friends, maybe 40 people total. Nothing fancy, just love and celebration overlooking the water that had brought me so much peace. That's when the Willow Creek Homeowners Association entered my life like a tornado. The HOA had been formed just 5 years ago when the county rezoned our area and several new developments went up nearby. Most of us original residents had been grandfathered in, but we were technically part of the association now. For years, it was just quarterly meetings about road maintenance and trash pickup. Boring, necessary stuff. Then Margaret Henley bought the house 3 streets over and immediately got herself elected as HOA president. Margaret was one of those women who seemed to have been born wearing a pantsuit and carrying a gavel. Within 6 months of moving in, she had tripled the number of regulations, instituted mandatory property inspections, and started sending violation notices for things like unapproved garden gnomes and non-regulation mailbox heights. The first time she showed up at my door was on a Tuesday morning in March. I was tending to my vegetable garden when I heard the click of high heels on my gravel driveway. "Mrs. Peterson?" she called out, consulting her clipboard like a general reviewing battle plans. "I'm Margaret Henley, HOA president. We need to discuss several violations on your property." I wiped the dirt from my hands and walked over, curious more than concerned. "Violations?" She proceeded to list off 8 different infractions, from my non-compliant fence color, it was natural wood stain, apparently 2 shades too dark, to my vegetable garden being visible from the street in violation of the community's aesthetic standards. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "But I've had that garden for 15 years, and the fence was approved by the county when we built it." Margaret's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "Mrs. Peterson, things change. We have standards to maintain now. Property values to protect. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand, but I also didn't want to start a war over a fence, so I agreed to look into repainting it. That seemed to satisfy her, and she clicked away down my driveway, leaving me with a stack of papers and a very uneasy feeling. Over the next few months, Margaret's visits became more frequent and more aggressive. My wind chimes were too loud. My truck was parked incorrectly in my own driveway. The wildflowers I had planted in memory of Tom were weeds that needed to be removed immediately. But I bit my tongue and complied with most of her demands, because I had bigger things to worry about, like planning a wedding and trying to heal from years of grief. The first real warning sign came in July when I submitted the required paperwork for our wedding celebration. According to the HOA bylaws, any gathering of more than immediate family required advance approval. So I filled out the forms, paid the fee, and submitted everything 6 weeks in advance, exactly as required. 2 days later, Margaret called me. "Mrs. Peterson, I've reviewed your application, and I'm afraid we have some concerns." Would you have trusted the sweetness in her voice? Because I certainly did, and that was my first mistake. Margaret's concerns started small, like drops of poison in a well. The parking situation, the noise levels, the disruption to the community. Each one seemed reasonable on its own, easily addressed with a simple phone call or modification to our plans. "Of course, we can arrange for shuttle service from the main road," I told her during our first meeting about the wedding. "And we'll have the ceremony end by 8 p.m., well before the noise ordinance kicks in." Margaret nodded along, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "And the guest count?" 42 people, just like I listed on the application. She tapped her pen against her teeth. "That does seem like quite a lot for a residential property." "It's 5 acres, Margaret, and most of it is outdoors by the lake. Still, we'll need to review the impact on the neighborhood. I'll have to schedule a site inspection." The site inspection turned into 3 site inspections. Margaret arrived each time with a different committee member, finding new issues with every visit. The pathway to the lake was apparently a safety hazard. The area where we planned to set up chairs might damage the natural vegetation. Our chosen caterer wasn't on the approved vendor list, a list I discovered had been created just weeks before and contained exactly 0 local businesses. Each obstacle felt designed to frustrate me into giving up. But this wedding meant too much to me to let Margaret's power games ruin it. So I kept jumping through her hoops, addressing every concern, filing amended applications, and paying additional fees. That's when the anonymous complaints started. First, the county health department showed up to investigate reports of unsanitary conditions on my property. They found nothing, of course, but I spent a terrifying afternoon wondering if someone had planted evidence or if I had missed something serious. Then came the fire marshal, responding to concerns about fire hazards and blocked emergency access. Again, everything was fine, but the inspector seemed puzzled about who had filed such a detailed complaint about a property he deemed one of the safest he'd seen in years. The pattern became clear when I ran into my neighbor Pete at the hardware store. Pete had lived in the area even longer than I had, and his property shared a fence line with mine. "Sarah," he said, his weathered face creased with concern, "I don't know if I should tell you this, but Margaret Henley was at my house yesterday asking a lot of questions about your wedding plans." "What kind of questions?" "Specific stuff. How many cars were you expecting? Would there be amplified music? Did I think the celebration might attract undesirable elements to the neighborhood?" Pete shook his head in disgust. I told her it was none of her business, but she kept pressing. Said she was gathering information for some kind of report. A cold dread settled in my stomach. "What kind of report?" "Something about getting your permits revoked. Said she had connections at the county level who could shut down your wedding if there were enough violations." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction with Margaret, looking for signs I had missed. The way she had smiled when delivering bad news. How she always seemed to know exactly which buttons to push. The careful legal language she used, like she was building a case rather than having a conversation. David found me at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by HOA documents and local ordinances. Honey, what's all this? I looked up at the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, and for the first time since Tom died, I felt truly helpless. I think she's trying to stop our wedding. What, Sarah? That's… David sat down across from me, taking in the papers spread across the table. She can't do that, can she? It's your property. I don't know. The admission felt like defeat. I've been reading these bylaws for hours, and there are so many clauses and subclauses and exceptions. She keeps finding new rules I've supposedly broken. David reached across the table and took my hands. We'll figure this out. Maybe we should get a lawyer. With what money? We've already spent everything we saved on the wedding deposits. The next morning brought a certified letter. Margaret had scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting to address ongoing violations and the upcoming Peterson event. The meeting was set for the following Thursday, exactly 2 weeks before our wedding. I called Margaret to ask what this was about. Oh, just standard procedure, she said, though there was something sharp and victorious in her voice. Some residents have expressed concerns about the scale of your event and its potential impact on the community. We need to address those concerns properly. What residents? I'm not at liberty to share specific names, of course. Privacy concerns. Margaret, please, can't we work this out between us? It's just one day. Mrs. Peterson, she interrupted, her voice turning ice cold, this isn't personal. This is about maintaining the standards and property values that make Willow Creek the desirable community it is. I'm sure you understand. But I was beginning to understand something else entirely. This wasn't about standards or property values. This was about power, and Margaret had decided to use my wedding as a way to flex hers. The emergency board meeting was held in the community center, a small building that served as our neighborhood's gathering place. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, and was shocked to see nearly 30 people there. In 3 years of HOA meetings, we'd never had more than 8 attendees. Margaret called the meeting to order with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for federal court proceedings. She had prepared a presentation complete with slides and handouts outlining what she called the Peterson problem. According to Margaret's report, my wedding would bring excessive traffic, parking violations, noise disruptions, and security concerns to our peaceful neighborhood. She had photographs of my property taken from various angles, with areas circled in red to highlight potential code violations and safety hazards. The most damaging part came when she began reading from anonymous complaints. Neighbors worried about strangers wandering through our community. Concerns about property damage and liability issues. Fear that my event would set a dangerous precedent for future gatherings. I sat there, listening to my own neighbors, people I had waved to for over 20 years, being turned against me by a woman who had lived here for less than 2 years. It felt like a betrayal so profound I could barely breathe. When Margaret finished her presentation, she opened the floor for questions. Several board members asked detailed questions about parking plans and noise mitigation questions that seemed designed to trap me rather than genuinely address concerns. Then Pete stood up. With all due respect, Margaret, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped build this community from nothing, this whole thing is ridiculous. Sarah Peterson has been a model neighbor for over 20 years. She and Tom were always the first to help anyone who needed it. They plowed our driveways during storms, brought casseroles when people were sick, and never once caused a problem for anyone. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, I felt a spark of hope. Margaret's smile tightened. Mr. Williams, I appreciate your loyalty to Mrs. Peterson, but we're not here to discuss the past. We're here to address current regulations and the impact of this proposed event on our community. What impact? Pete shot back. It's one afternoon on her own property. Since when do we police people's private celebrations? Since we became responsible for maintaining property values and community standards, Margaret replied smoothly. I'm sure Mrs. Peterson understands that her personal desires can't supersede the needs of the broader community. The vote was called immediately after that exchange. 4 board members voted to approve my wedding with standard conditions. 3 voted to deny the permit entirely. Margaret cast the tie-breaking vote. I'm sorry, Mrs. Peterson, but given the significant concerns raised by community members and the potential liability issues, I have to vote to deny your application. However, she added with that cold smile, you're welcome to reapply with a scaled-down event that better aligns with our community standards. I left that meeting feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. But as I drove home past the lake that had given me so much comfort over the years, something hardened inside me. Margaret Henley had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Have you ever had one of those moments where everything suddenly clicks into place? Where all the puzzle pieces you've been staring at finally form a picture so clear you can't believe you missed it before? That moment came for me 3 days after the board meeting, in the most unlikely place possible, the county courthouse basement. I had gone there to research property records, hoping to find some legal precedent that might help me challenge the HOA's decision. David thought I was wasting my time, and maybe I was, but I couldn't just accept defeat without a fight. The courthouse clerk, a sweet elderly woman named Betty, helped me navigate the filing system. As we pulled records for my property and the surrounding area, she made casual conversation about the neighborhood. Oh, Willow Creek, she said, recognition lighting up her face. That's where all the fuss has been lately. Fuss? Well, maybe I shouldn't say anything, but we've had quite a few requests for records from that area recently. Someone's been doing a lot of research on property boundaries, deed restrictions, that sort of thing. My pulse quickened. What kind of research? Betty glanced around to make sure we were alone, then leaned in conspiratorially. Between you and me, it looked like someone was trying to find legal grounds to challenge property rights in the area. Very thorough work, the kind lawyers do when they're building a case. Do you remember who was doing the research? Oh, I'm not supposed to say. She glanced around again. But it was that HOA president. Henley, I think. She's been in here at least 6 times in the past 2 months. The pieces started falling into place. Margaret hadn't been responding to complaints about my wedding, she had been manufacturing them. But why? What did she have to gain from ruining my celebration? I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through records, and what I found made my blood run cold. Margaret Henley hadn't just moved to Willow Creek to join our community. She had come with a purpose. The records showed that Margaret was part of a limited liability company called Lakeside Development Group. Over the past year, this company had quietly purchased 3 properties in our neighborhood, all of them backing up to Mirror Lake, just like mine. But here's the thing about real estate development. You need a critical mass of property to make a project viable. 3 lakefront lots might be enough for luxury homes, but 5 lots could support something much bigger. Something like a private resort or exclusive housing development. Margaret wasn't just trying to stop my wedding. She was trying to drive me out of my home. I called an old friend of mine, Jenny Martinez, who worked in real estate law. We had gone to high school together, and she had always been the smartest person in any room. Jenny, I need a favor. Can you look up something called Lakeside Development Group and tell me what you find? 2 hours later, my phone rang. Sarah, Jenny's voice was grim. You need to sit down for this. Lakeside Development Group was owned by a consortium of investors planning to build a luxury resort on Mirror Lake. They had been quietly buying up waterfront properties for over 2 years, using local agents and shell companies to hide their involvement. The project was worth tens of millions of dollars, but it required control of the entire lakefront to be viable. There are only two properties they don't own yet, Jenny told me. Yours and the old Morrison place on the north end of the lake. But how does Margaret fit into all this? Well, the good news is that they can't move forward without your property. The bad news is that if they can prove your land is being used in violation of local regulations, they might be able to force a sale through eminent domain. Is that what the wedding permit denial was about? Probably, if they can establish a pattern of HOA violations and community disruption, they could argue that your property ownership is detrimental to the neighborhood. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking out at the lake that Margaret wanted to destroy. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and pink that no luxury resort could ever replicate. Tom's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "Don't let them win, Sarah. This is our home." That's when I made a decision that would change everything. If Margaret wanted a fight, I was going to give her one. But first, I needed to gather my allies. Actually, Margaret, I think we need to start with some truth for once. I continued reading from the development documents, detailing how Margaret's company planned to destroy the lake's ecosystem, displace the local wildlife, and transform our peaceful community into a commercial tourist destination. With each revelation, the crowd's anger intensified. "You lied to us," Pete Williams called out. "You made us think Sarah was the problem when you were the one trying to destroy our neighborhood." Margaret tried to regain control. "These are private business documents that have no bearing on HOA matters." "They have everything to do with HOA matters?" I shot back. "You used your position as president to harass residents you wanted to drive out. You manufactured complaints, violated due process, and abused your authority to serve your own financial interests." "I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in Margaret Henley as HOA president," I announced. "And I'm requesting that the board reverse its decision on my wedding permit." As for my wedding permit, the new interim president, Pete Williams, made a motion to approve it unanimously with a public apology for the harassment I had endured. 6 months later, I received a letter from Margaret's lawyers demanding that I cease spreading false information about her business activities. I forwarded it to Jenny, who responded with a counter-threat regarding Margaret's documented harassment and fraud. We never heard from them again. The old Morrison place, on the north end of the lake, was eventually sold to a conservation group that turned it into a nature preserve, ensuring that our corner of the world will remain unspoiled for generations to come. As for David and me, we're happier than I ever imagined possible. We built a small guest house on the property where Tom and I used to have our vegetable garden, and we host community gatherings there, regularly movie nights, potluck dinners, and holiday celebrations that bring our neighbors together in the spirit of genuine fellowship. The HOA still exists, but it's returned to its original purpose of maintaining roads and organizing the occasional cleanup day. We have simple, common-sense rules that everyone helped write, and we've never had another Margaret Henley try to take us over. But mostly, I think about the strength that comes from community, real community, not the fake version Margaret tried to impose on us. I think about neighbors who stand up for each other, who refuse to be divided by fear and lies, and who understand that some things are more valuable than money. Would you have fought back the way I did? Would you have risked everything to save something you loved? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing about how others have stood up to bullies and manipulators in their own lives. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength when their homes and communities are threatened, please subscribe to this channel. There are so many more tales of triumph over tyranny, of neighbors helping neighbors, and of the power that comes when good people refuse to be intimidated.